purpose of this theoretical framework is. He wrote this, kind of in a few major works that define his career. And the first of these was published in 1980, Environment and Society. And so when we look at this, and here it is down here, the environment, this is the work, 1980, the environment, from surplus to scarcity. So if anybody's interested in the book, you can check it out there. But basically, the framework describes a process where problems that are associated with production, and when I mean production, it's the stuff around us, right? Producing these things around us. They lead to, the way to get away from those problems is simply more production, right? So, if it's unemployment, how do you get out of unemployment problems? Well, we manufacture more, we put more people to work that way, we produce more, which ironically, because of the way things are organized, produces more of the same problems that we had before, thus the treadmill, right? So it's a circle, a kind of vicious circle in some ways. Why the problem? The thermodynamics, laws of thermodynamics are not the problem, but they do explain why the problem, we have the problem. So there are two important aspects to this. The first aspect, and you can see these little, these energy blocks up here. One is that, we can't create and we can't destroy energy, right? What we have is what we have, right? Energy can't be created or destroyed. So the idea is that it can be transformed, right? Which is part of the interaction between the economy and ecology. It can be transformed, but it can't be destroyed. Can't be created. We don't get it from nowhere, right? And so this is, and you'll see this kind of play out through the rest of the presentation when I'm talking about energy. I'm going to use fracking, which is apparently a big deal here, also in the UK now, in the north, because the north is now I heard somebody say on CNN today that, what is it, they're worried about how much gas there is in the north because now they're going to extract it all. And I'll talk about some of what's going on actually in my state in the US related to fracking. So this is central because it deals with energy, right? And where we get our energy and how we get our energy. So energy, you can't create it, you can't destroy it, but you can change its form clearly, right? Through burning of fossil fuels, etc. And the second law that's important is that as we transform energy, right, it becomes more disorganized in nature. Right? In other words, we don't use it all, right? First of all, for productive purposes. We lose some in all these different forms, right? Heat and so forth and so on. Engines aren't perfect, right? Manufacturing isn't perfect, thus we lose some of this energy. But the point is that it becomes disorganized over time. We take what was once organized maybe by nature, coal and other things, and it becomes disorganized as we transform that to products, right? And use that energy to create products. So some of it's usable, some of it may not be, but that's how it works. So what problems does this lead to for the ecology? Well, we kind of organize these along Schneiberg's major conception of this, which is we talk about both ecological withdrawals, and the first picture here is just, coal mining, right? Just major, big mountaintop removal or strip mining in this case, and ecological additions, which would include the pollution that comes out of the production process. So when we talk about how do we organize ecological problems, this is how we would organize them into these two separate parts. And here's just an example of some of the things we're talking about with regards to ecological withdrawals and additions, and this is global carbon emissions for fossil fuel. And the important thing here is that it's going up, right? So we would look at this in terms of production. That's part of what I'm going to talk about in a minute, accumulation and the continual production of things. This is what treadmill of production would say, right? In other words, we don't predict a decrease in energy use. And in fact, if you look at all energy sectors, and I'll show you natural gas here in a little bit, what you see are increases in these things. And so if there are problems associated with, can solve them according to some factions, business, for example, treadmill institutions by more production. And this is the indicators that we see. Right? We had to define ecological disorganization some way, right? So ironically, we don't see it much in Schneiberg's work, and the treadmill of production theorists don't talk about necessarily what it is, and for an exact definition, it's tough to pull one out. So this is what we developed. It's the disruption of the normal functioning of the ecosystem in a way that sufficiently impedes its regeneration and reproduction. And this is going to be important because this is what we use to define green crime. It can occur when the physical structure of an ecosystem is compromised, or relationships between or among organisms are compromised. So this is the idea. This is what when we talk about ecological disorganization, this is again what we're talking about. And that kind of leads us into this notion of treadmill of crime, which we have been working on developing, and the extension of that, which is this idea of treadmill of law. So treadmill of crime, we are redefining crime to say that it's acts that cause significant harm to ecological systems for the purposes of accumulation. And we're going to talk about what accumulation is in a minute, but it's obviously related to production. So we want to know then, the unanswered question we feel is, how does criminal law, defined by the state, for example, develop and mediate the relationship between the ecology and the economy? And we actually define this in terms of the treadmill of laws as the following. It's the organization of law in ways that reinforce the interest of the treadmill of production and the persistent expansion of capital interests and accumulation and economic growth. So let's kind of look at some of this now. So the treadmill of law looks at the economy and ecology, withdraws and additions, which we just talked about. It draws on this notion of treadmill of production and crime to better develop the construction of criminal laws that focus on the environment. So how do these laws, and why do these laws get formed? Why do they change? So forth and so on. This wasn't completely left unaddressed by Schneiberg and some of his colleagues. And in fact, when they talk about the state and other organizations, for example, they mention struggles, right? And here's a good example of the kind of level that Schneiberg does address some of these. I mean, they recognize this, right? So he says right in his book on page 24, right? Treadmill organizations generally resist environmental regulation with all the substantial means at their disposal, which would include criminal regulation, obviously. Which brings us kind of to the forces then. What we do is expand on this. So this brings us to the forces that shape criminal law. And so what we're trying to do is back up a little bit, and I'll talk about why we're doing that in a minute. But obviously important to this is the notion of free markets. So, when we talk about free markets and environmentalism, there's a lot of folks that talk about free markets solving environmental problems, right? I mean, maybe not the folks in this room, but if you talk to people in business, they're certain that free markets will solve environmental problems. And in fact, there's a lot of work on this that gets a lot of attention by business leaders, for example, that then they promote. They use to promote this model of free market solving environmental problems. So they say, here's an example right here from Anderson and Leo, who get probably more cites to their work than criminology altogether, maybe. Right? They suggest that free market environmentalism will save the planet, and they call them enviro-capitalists, will use their economic power to protect the biosphere. Right? And of course, there are people critical of free market environmentalism. I mean, this doesn't go unchallenged. I mean, most of us in this room probably question the idea of free market environmentalism. But, and here's just, Sunstein, who says, look, this is kind of crazy. free markets can create injustice as well as, solve these problems, right? It can limit freedom. And of course, when you look at problems of inequality, this is just a good example of where, so you can see that this is where fossil fuels are burned, right? Are mostly burned, and the blue is the highest, and so the developed country does a lot more of this damage to the planet, obviously, than some of the other countries. U.S. being chief among them, and you can do this as a total, or you can do it per capita if you want. The results do change a little bit, but not much. Right, so besides free markets, we also have the problem of accumulation, right? So, and this is part of this treadmill. So the idea is that you got to accumulate, right? In other words, how do you have these technological innovations, right, that are supposed to save the planet? Well, that's through new technology, right? Through new means. But it's also the capitalists are also searching to produce more, because the problem is if you don't produce more, what happens? I mean, if you talk to anybody, nobody's going to say, I want to maintain the same level of production I had last year, right? The idea is that you have to have more than you had last year. That's the only way it works. And if you don't have more than you had last year, then you've got a problem, right? You may be out of business soon, right? And certainly if you say that to your shareholders, they're not going to like that, because they're looking to make a profit. So, as a shareholder, I might take my money, my capital out if you start talking about, I don't need to increase production anymore. I'm happy with what we have, right? So the notion is here that, accumulation has to occur. Well, what do you do with the money then that you accumulate? You put it back into production. So Schneiber, when he was looking at this, he said, well, where did the money go? It went into labor-saving technology, which was chemical production, right? Mainly chemical production, and certainly we still use chemical production today, no question, right? I mean, if you look at how do we get, mountaintop removal that are strip mining, we use a lot of chemicals in that to process the coal, even to blow the mountains apart, right? And we have to use chemicals to do this. So the point is that's more efficient. It's done through these labor-saving technologies, and it often uses chemical technology to do these kinds of extractions. So it's more proficient. And if you don't do this, you go out of business, right? Or die as a company. And so our argument then is that environmental laws have to allow capitalists to continue to accumulate, essentially. Right? And if you look at where these laws and how these laws develop, this is what we would say, right? So they rely on ecological withdrawals and additions, and we can't really mess with those ecological withdrawals and additions without messing with capital. So accumulation is important, right? We can't mess up this accumulation process. So the other thing is ideology, right? And so how do you sell this idea of free markets and environmental capitalism and accumulation? And the way that we sell it is through ideology, that essentially that free markets are linked somehow to democracy, and if you mess with free markets, you're really messing with democracy. Or economic growth is sometimes linked to democracy, and if you mess with that, you're screwing up freedom. So the idea here is that this is how we justify these withdrawals and additions. And of course, that doesn't have to be the case, right, necessarily. Here's Fukuyama's, kind of take on this. He says capitalism doesn't have to be necessarily generate pressures for democracy, and of course that's true. Right. So what we did is we kind of used these concepts along with observations from Schneiber to develop the Treadmill of Law propositions that we've started testing empirically. So these are things that we want to use data to look at and test. And so the first proposition is essentially that treadmill organizations will oppose, this is similar to what Schneiberg said, will oppose the formation of criminal laws to stop environmental disorganization or ecological disorganization, which, you know, everybody in here would probably say, well, of course, right? Of course, that's what would happen, right? And this one, so this one's more of an obvious proposition, and again, mirrors what Schneiberg said. The second kind of proposition that we have is that workers employed in industry that create ecological disorganization will often align with treadmill organizations against the formation of laws that criminalize ecological disorganization. So what this really means is that it pits workers against, they're against the environment in some cases. And in the US, we see this often with coal, right? So the idea is that coal extraction is necessary for employment in some of these, coal country, in some of these counties in the U.S. And so workers, when you talk about, well, we're going to stop production of coal, or we're going to slow down production, or we're going to criminalize certain acts, the industry will often, fight back by saying, if you do this, we're going to lose jobs. And I'll show you this related to natural gas extraction here in a moment, because it's exactly what they say, what they're saying right now, as a matter of fact. And so there's some good examples of that. The other idea here, the third proposition, is that state actors only create and enforce laws that don't change general trends in production. Right, so, when we think about criminal laws, you can have a variety of criminal laws, but the ones that tend to get enforced may be the ones that don't slow production down. Right, so we've done a little bit of work kind of looking at this, especially with large fines, right? So this idea that we can deter our way out of the problem of ecological disorganization if we only enforce better, right? And what we find is even in the largest fines, when we're talking million dollar fines, these are huge fines, it doesn't actually change. It may change how the companies act with a certain part of their productive process, but it doesn't change their overall behavior related to the environment, right? So in other words, pollution continues, right? And in fact, it increases because companies have to increase production. They may, in fact, employ environmental technology that should slow down or should consume less, In other words, we could save something, right? And capture some of the emissions and then use them again in the production process, and therefore we're green, right? And companies do that. I've seen companies that claim to have zero waste, right? We've redesigned our whole production process to have zero waste. The problem is that if you track their production, it continues to go up. So, yeah, you can reduce what you use in the production process, but it doesn't mean that your overall production is decreasing, right? Because you're producing more, right? So I could save 50, but I'm producing 110, right? And so when we come in with these environmental laws that are focused on one or two things, yeah, we can reorganize that, but it doesn't stop production. Right? We may be able to slow something down, we may be able to deter a thing here and there, but overall, production increases, and so criminal laws do very little, at least as currently defined. The other thing, the last proposition we have here is Proposition 4, and that's that few environmental groups will define treadmill organizations as criminal, and therefore they have little influence on the definition of criminal law. So this is we've addressed some of these issues of NGOs and other things today, and certainly some NGOs fight to define corporate behavior as criminal. Right? We've seen some of that, like I say, in some earlier panels, and but overall, this is not the trend that we're seeing. And in fact, because of funding, a lot of these organizations are formal, they're big, and because of where the funding comes from, they may not be willing to make those assertions about criminal corporations, because if you're trying to get money, sometimes you don't want to challenge the corporations or the state in that way, right? I mean, you're not going to, I think one environmental activist says, you're not going to kind of bite the hand that's giving you the the money, right? And a lot of times if you look at those, we've been also looking at some of the, what do the corporation, or what do these NGOs do, and you can see that, you know, they follow whatever their grant is at that time, supporting their organization. I mean, that's what directs what they do. I mean, it has to, right? So for a lot of the formalized groups, this becomes pretty difficult. And, you know, it depends on where they get their funding as well. So, so what this means, and this is actually out of, you know, political process, which comes out of public affairs, but you know, people study the creation of policies and laws and so forth. They've been doing this for a long time, and so we look at this idea of treadmill of law as actually, you know, shaping the way all of this political process plays out, you know. So this whole idea of agenda setting, which is the first part of this, which may come through a number of different avenues. Here, you know, public attention focuses on a problem, so I guess we're talking about fracking in a minute, but, you know, officials' words and actions help focus attention. Well, they do, but this all comes in the context of accumulation, you know, the idea of accumulation, production, and you know, these kind of ideals of democracy and so forth, and that's what's going to shape criminal laws regarding this. So, you know, these kind of policy process models that talk about how law forms are great, but they're missing that key component, which is this idea of accumulation, right? This is where they develop within this system. So this is the example that I want to talk about a little bit, which again I think may resonate with people here. So fracking is a method of natural gas extraction. It was developed in the 1940s and patented by Halliburton, which is probably a nationally known name by now because they're involved in a lot of things, including I think part of the BP blowout most recently. They provided some structural support, I think. But anyway, the idea is that it's based on chemical, like we said before, chemical production, right? This is, fracking uses chemicals, right? That's how they get this, part of the way that they get this out of the ground, right? This natural gas out of the ground. Chemicals and pressure and technology, right? And the idea of natural gas being important, and this is developed because technology has advanced. It not only allows us to drill down, but it also allows us to drill sideways now, right, and under the ground. So, you know, that was part of what was constraining the extraction of natural gas before, is we couldn't drill it sideways, right? We could go straight down and we could get whatever natural gas we could get out, but now we can use this technology to get it in all kinds of ways. And here, what you see. And I think this is pretty interesting in terms of, these are projections up to 2040, right? So 2040 starts in 90, and then after you pass 2010, everything's a projection. But you can see essentially the increase in natural gas production. In fact, when coal production may be declining a little bit, where they estimate about 2035, we might see a little leveling off, because we're still using a ton of coal, right? Obviously. A ton of petroleum and other things, but you can see a little dip. Natural gas extraction is going to catch up, right? So this is important. And here you can see, like in terms of percentages between 1990 and 2040, that natural gas is estimated to grow 153%, just a little more than coal, and a lot more than liquid gas. Right? So this is a huge, when we're talking about economics, right, this is a major source of energy that's needed to help accumulation. And we have to have it. I mean, you can see how much where this fits in terms of coal and other gas. So it's a major part of that. The way fracking works, this diagram, I don't know how well you can see it, but it shows the well, the casing, the little black part is a casing that goes down, right? And it goes down so far, and then, past the water table, down into the ground, and then here, it obviously, it turns sideways, right? They can drill sideways to get to these gas deposits, and then through pressure and chemicals, you can create these fissures that you can see coming out down here. And this is how you get the gas. You create these fissures, and then the gas can be collected out of these fissures and collected and up in these holding tanks, that are shown over here on the side. Actually, that hold the gas, water tanks and holding tanks over here. So it requires a mixture of chemicals, high pressure, lots of water. By the way, the early arguments there's a couple about fracking. One of the arguments that came out is that it uses a ton of water, right? We're using way too much water. I think I have some estimates on another slide here. But so the companies have responded with technology, right? So the idea is, well, right? Good corporate governance. Technology can solve the problem, right? We'll use less water. Well, that's fine, except you saw the natural gas projections. We're going to collect and get more gas out of the environment. So it doesn't matter if you save water, we're still going to use more because we're producing more gas, right? We're collecting, we're extracting more gas. So you can see here again that this is how this is supposed to work. The problem, of course, with this is that there's a few. One is that there's a rate of failure. This is the other argument that industry makes. There's a rate of failure on the casings, right? So they weren't initially always using casings. Now they do. Those are the cement, that goes around through the water table, so the chemicals don't leak out into the water, right? This is supposed to be the thing, but those fail. There's been studies. Engineers do studies on these things, and we know there's a certain percentage of failure of those casings. So that's how water gets contaminated. And so their argument is, of course, that it's nothing to do with fracking necessarily, similar to what Nigel was saying earlier. It really has to do with the fact that the casings are faulty, and when we figure that out, everything will be fine, right? So the casings sometimes are a problem here. The other problem is once these fissures start, we don't know where they necessarily stop, right? So there's been initial estimates, these aren't a problem, but there are weaknesses in the shale, right? And so some engineers, you should figure this, study this kind of stuff. And so they say, well, yeah, the fissures can go, but we don't know if there's weaknesses, whether or not those fissures can go farther than they're supposed to, reaching a water supply. The other problem is if you look at a state like Texas that has thousands and thousands of wells that were drilled over a long period of time, Oklahoma, I suppose, too, you're dotted with these older wells. Well, the problem becomes, we don't know where those are, so if you're fracking near one of these older wells, those fissures may reach those wells, which will contaminate the water supply. So this is how these withdrawals work right now, and this is how they're working in Colorado. So what are some of the arguments that are made? Here's the economy, right? So when we talk about the Treadmill of Law and kind of the opposition by industry, the gas industry, oil and gas industry. You can see here, here's a quote by Hawthorne, Robert Hawthorne. He says, at present, fracking accounts for 50%. This is in the journal Nature. It was a debate. Accounts for 50% of the locally produced natural and 33% of the local petroleum. The gas industry in America accounts for about $385 billion in direct economic activity and nearly 3 million jobs. Because gas wells have notoriously steep production declines, stable supply-demand on a steady rate of new well completions, a moratorium on new wells would have a harsh effect on the U.S. economy and would trigger a global ripple. So if we stop our fracking, watch out, because everybody's in trouble economically. There are right now about 35,000 fracking wells in the U.S., according to some recent estimates. This takes about 52 billion to 175 billion gallons of water annually. Again, water technology is improving, right? I mean, this is one of the big criticisms, especially we in Colorado are basically in the desert. And so you can imagine the amount of water we're using that cities are giving to fracking. Well, the problem becomes, what do residents do in these towns that need to drink water? And so there are complaints about increasing water supply and so forth. And water is essentially a free market commodity in Colorado where we live as well. So these guys can go in and buy the water up, right, to use in production. So yes, they're doing better with water, and I wouldn't argue that point, but we're using more of it because we're fracking more. Chemicals used can leak into the environment. I kind of talked about how that occurs. There's still huge debates over that. One of the interesting things that's been proposed, or the policies that have been proposed around this, is people say, well, we can simply put some tracer chemicals into the fracking mixture, the water chemical mixture, right? And the idea would be, from an environmental enforcement standpoint, that I now have a fingerprint. It's like a DNA fingerprint. So I can figure out if this well becomes contaminated, and there's 50 frackers around, I can actually figure out who's liable by this signature chemical. The companies have successfully opposed any such measure, so that's not going to happen. The other thing you can see with the treadmill of production is there's no federal regulation. Gas and oil is left up to states and not the federal government. So each state can do these things differently. So landowners, the way it works in Colorado is landowners sell mineral rights essentially to companies who then can come in and drill on their land. And I'm going to show you a few pictures here in a minute that are somewhat scary if you live in some of these areas. So as a result, what's happened? Well, local governments pass bans. Well, remember what we said with the treadmill of law. Well, what's the first thing that happens? The minute those local governments pass bans, these groups may get together to try to stop this and put pressure on local governments. The state has come back now and sued these local governments to stop the ban of fracking, right? Or stop the selling of mineral rights and allow fracking to occur. So the question is, who can regulate gas extraction? But more importantly, if you listen to what people are saying and how they're fighting this, it's like, hey, we have a right to sell to whoever we want to, right? Democracy, we start talking about free markets and democracy. People who want to come in and regulate this are communists and socialists. Get out of our way. Let us sell our mineral rights to whoever we want to. So you can see all of these issues tied together, right? And so, this is just an example. Here's some protests here, like no fracking. You can see this. It's not natural, but these have had little influence right now. It's caused a lot of public debate, but it's had little influence on, the process of production right now. It's going on, whether we like it or not, and it's expanding whether we like it or not. And we can see the projections for 2040, whether we like it or not, right? Here's an EPA regulator I talked to. This is a criminal regulator, right? Criminal investigator from the EPA in our division in Colorado basically said, I have no idea what's in the fracking material fluids. There's not much I can do, even if I wanted to. Right? Again, it's not governed by federal legislation, but we know that in some cases there may be stuff that's being used that's criminal in the fracking materials. But because companies hold that a secret, it's a trade secret, we're not allowed to look at it. So, how do you enforce the law in those cases? It's, even if we wanted to, we couldn't. Right? Here's the example, of Colorado. So these are some colleagues of mine at Colorado State. They're working on some of these issues right now and looking at victims, essentially. And you can see here's a fracking, here's a well, right? And look in the back is the neighborhood right there. And actually, I think you can see, if you can look close enough, I think there's a playground back in here, but these are all houses. You could throw a baseball from one of those backyards right into this fracking. Well, here's another example of here's a container, right? You can see this, the holding tanks, the containers, other fracking, and here's the neighborhood right back here. In fact, the house is probably within, 50 feet of this, even though I think there's a distance. I think it's 50 feet. It certainly looks like they may have violated that here. Here's a house for sale, ready to move in, it says. They're right in the back, right here is another tank, right? So, this is going on, again, everywhere. People are opposing it, but this is the economic the economics of this, and again, here's holding tanks, are not going to allow this to stop and be criminalized. And my colleagues tell me this is a fugitive emission somewhere here, right there. So it's an illegal emissions, basically, that's happening. There have been very few criminal cases, and on this, I think there's one in Texas and one in one other state, but it does not look like any of this is going to be criminalized, even though it causes tremendous harm, potentially tremendous harm. And we know from some of the preliminary studies that wells are being contaminated, but there's obviously, it's being contested. So that's it. Thanks, guys.
Well, thank you, Paul. So one more speaker for today, that's Lieselot Bisschop from the University of Ghent in Belgium. Cheers.
First of all, thank you for the invite, Tanya. I was invited to speak about my e-waste case for my PhD research. So for those who have already heard parts of it, I'm sorry for the repetition. I hope I can nevertheless say something new since I have more time than we usually get at a conference, so I appreciate that. So my PhD research on transnational environmental crime did a comparison of two cases, e-waste and timber. Of course, I'll talk about e-waste here. Two main questions. How is it organized? How do these flows of illegal timber or illegal e-waste emerge? Looking at scope and impact, motivating factors, and also looking at legal-illegal interfaces in terms of actors that are involved. So those were also my theoretical frameworks I used there. And then secondly, governance. Who is preventing this harm from occurring? Who is controlling for crime? Using regulatory hybrids, the models, you can see them listed there. And what I did is a nodal network governance analysis, so I looked at the nodes separately, so each of the actors, governments, corporations, civil society actors, before looking at their interaction. But I'll get to that when I explain this. This is also reflected in the structure of what I'm going to talk about. So just set the legal framework first, method and research setting, scale, impact, and then the two central questions and conclusion. The legal framework for e-waste, of course, parts of it is waste in general or hazardous waste in general. International, there's a lot of it. The Basel Convention, OECD decision, Montreal Protocol, which also has already been talked about. Also, the EU has often implemented this more stringently. Especially the WE directive on e-waste is relevant here, but also the general WSR, the waste shipment regulation. Basically, it depends on how hazardous your waste is. You have to inform the authorities of where it's going to go. So notify also sometimes the authorities of the countries where it's going. And depending on what it is, you might also require consent of them. This means you need to provide information about where it's going, which is sometimes a sensitive issue in a competitive business. In general, transports towards non-OECD countries of e-waste are banned. But this is difficult because used goods, electronic goods are allowed to be transported, and there's a thin line between those two sometimes. In general, you have to prove, you have to have appropriate documentation, you have to have proof of testing, so what you're shipping needs to work, need to provide contact details, and it needs to be appropriately packed. Even though those guidelines were there by the European Union, it's not easy in practice to do this. So interpretation of that is quite difficult sometimes. What did I do? Document analysis, various sources I could get my hands on. I hope to get court cases as well, which proved to be difficult because there are hardly any in Belgium. And those that were ongoing, I wasn't allowed access to. Did 56 semi-structured interviews with several actors, government actors, civil society, corporate representatives. Those corporate representatives sometimes also included smugglers or informal actors dealing in the e-waste, either in Belgium or in Ghana. Did field visits in the port of Antwerp and in Ghana, Accra and the port of Tema. Each time I try to make sure I have a triangulation of perspectives: government, corporate, civil society. Research setting, briefly, Judith already mentioned the port of Antwerp. It's true, it's a flexible port, I'll get to that. But just to sketch it, it's the third port in Europe. You can see how much ton there is of freight traded. It's about 11 million containers each year. It has a major storage capacity and is also very closely located towards, for instance, the southern part of Germany, the Rhineland. So it's a major transit port for that. Same as Rotterdam, actually. In terms of what territory we're looking at, it's very close to the city. You can actually easily walk towards the port. It's also accessible. It's about 130 square kilometers, a lot of roadways, quays, and railways, and about 900 companies. Less than 1% of containers is scanned. It's based on a risk analysis system. That's a pretty normal percentage, I've been told. And for waste, it's important to take into account that only 20% actually comes from Belgium or is imported into Belgium, and the rest of it, 80%, comes from other European countries and is in transit. The other case, completely different, the port of Tema in Ghana. Of course, a lot less trade there, but still a considerable port for the West African region. It's about 6 square kilometers. And important to notice is that they actually either scan or open and empty every container that comes into the port. All right, what are we talking about in terms of scale? Tanya asked me to try and assess this. I'll first start with a warning. It's already been said, but if you're looking at reports on statistics on this, it's very difficult. I tried to look at the Basel Convention. They themselves, the Secretariat answered me, well, not all parties report, or they report some years and not other years, so their data, not always a good estimate. EU intended to have a common database based on their regulations. Also those are not always good at this time. Belgium has been a difficult client in that because the different government agencies that deal with it have been reporting double cases. So we're solving it, but anyway. Also a problem is different interpretation. When is it waste? When do you simply say it's recyclable material? When is it a used good? It will not always go into the same statistics. So in general, I'd say it's best guesstimates, and what we have, it reflects the control rather than it reflects the actual transports occurring, as is often the case for crime in general, I guess. However, some best guesstimates to sketch it. In the EU, all trade, about 15% of that is waste. It's big business. The EU is also a major importer of waste, hazardous waste for recovery. For e-waste in particular, Belgium is one of those countries because we have a big refinery, a big recycling plant, Umicore. So there's some economic incentive to keep it in Europe. 51% of transports towards non-OECD countries of waste are considered to be illegal. That's based on inspection reports. So, but anyway, it gives some idea about it. Another way to assess it is how much do we use. About 15 to 20 kilograms a year is put into the market per person. Of course, not everything becomes obsolete right away. We know that for Belgium, about 10% is unaccounted for, which is actually pretty good, considering that some other European countries have a 65% rate of electronic waste being unaccounted for. Sometimes it's in an attic or in a basement or, I don't know, a student home somewhere, but some of it actually goes into, low quality recycling or illegal trade. And the trend is basically, you'll get it, it's the same as for the rest, developed towards developing countries. In terms of impact, those so-called recycling practices, I like the word that Nigel used for it. It's indeed part of the new production process maybe, but it's about dumping and burning. They will dismantle the equipment there by hand. So my case is Ghana. It's one of the pictures I took there, which used to be a lagoon. It actually pollutes the soil, the air, and the water because in the dismantling, in the burning, in the dumping, the toxic chemicals, toxic components get into the ground, the air. Of course, that's harmful. Also, it's about precarious working circumstances, so that's another element of harm. What is often not mentioned is that it's also economically harmful. Especially when I start looking at it from a European perspective, companies that might be dealing with this in a legal fashion consider this as unfair competition towards what they can offer in terms of prices. It has lower material recovery rates, very important in a time where secondary raw materials is a big thing. And in general also when there's money going around that might undermine policy making and law enforcement. That's another harmful element. This just to sketch the context, I'll get to my research questions now, answering them. The first one is social organization, and what I did is I looked throughout the flow. So looked at the supply chain and looked at different elements that might be contributing to the occurrence of illegal trade of e-waste. So starting producers, consumers, it's already been mentioned, but waste has developed over the years. Different quality, different quantity of e-waste in particular, different components used to produce it. Associated with higher waste management prices due to more regulation. That has already been sketched this context. So in general, producers play a role in this because they can choose whether to have products that are actually eco-designed in the sense that you can actually reuse them when you want an upgrade instead of get a new product altogether. Consumers play a role as well, and something I try to assess is which routes, which flows does it follow. Individual consumers basically use the official take-back system. They will also sometimes go to retailers when you buy something new, you give them the old product, or they will use communal collection parks and give it to those. Another major element, however, is corporate and governmental consumers. I don't know if this is the case here, but my university switches our computers every 3 years. We get a new one. So they will sell those to refurbishment firms because it's still worth something. They will wipe the data and then resell them again. And there's also an official take-back system for them, but there are other actors that might be involved in this. One of the quotes you can see there from one of my respondents, one of the refurbishers, said that sometimes he goes somewhere to buy, let's say Ghent University has 3,000 computers that they want to get rid of, old ones, and he will provide a certain price for that. Someone else will offer a completely different price, and he knows it can never be recycled or dismantled in Europe for that price. So this is just one of the cases where you could see it might be going into illegal flows. As I said, it's not only those official instances that can collect it. Waste sector is very complex, very competitive, and for e-waste, those actors you see listed there, they all play a role, and for some of them there's a risk in it going towards illegal transports. I won't go into detail, but generally it can be about individual, more informal actors like waste tourists, and it can actually vary towards a more organized sense, a more organized form of trading, where you can actually see entire containers of the same type of product being shipped towards Ghana. So a certain organizational element in there. Important to know, for waste in general, we often say there's an inverse economic incentive. If you have waste, you need to pay to get rid of it. That applies for e-waste partially, but for other elements of e-waste, you can actually earn money if you have it. People will pay you for it. So there's a double element there that's important to take into account. Then another element besides a push and a pull, which I'll get to, there are some actors that are facilitating the transports, actors and factors. There's cheap shipping. If you want to send something to Ghana, it really doesn't cost that much because those containers arrive here with goods. The same goes for China, for instance. There's containerization, so you don't see what's in there. And an element here is what I call the flexible port policy. In comparison to other ports, it's often said that Antwerp is more flexible, more open, which is an economic advantage, and they also use that to try and compete with Rotterdam. for instance. But this flexible element also makes it more, I don't know, criminogenic. Maybe it's too hard of a word, but anyway, there are some elements that might help smuggling. One of the quotes is from my respondents was that if you can get a container there on Friday, you'll know it won't get inspected and it will be on the ship and nobody will look at it. They might look at the documents at the point in time where the ship is already gone. So this plays a role. Actors of influence there, you can see them, sorry, port authorities, terminal operators, shipping lines, agents, brokers, all play a role. At the destination, one of the pictures I took myself, in Ghana there's a lot of stores, people selling, I think actually some of those fridges might be those with CFCs, but they don't have a legal framework to address this quite often. They might have signed international conventions but don't act upon it. For many actors there, selling this, dismantling this, it's a sole secure livelihood. It's their only source of income. It sometimes bridges the digital divide, gives them access to internet computers, creating a digital dump in that way sometimes, is said as well. And there's a demand for raw materials. On the dump sites of Agbobloshi in Accra, they want to get the copper out of there and the other metals, and there's a great demand for that, and they can actually earn a living. At the site of Ghana, there's a lot of informal actors involved. I don't want to call them criminals because I don't think they actually are. They're just people trying to make a living. So it's different than the illegal interfaces. I think those informal ones are another element that should be added. And eventually it also flows back into the production through the raw materials, for instance. In general, for social organization, push in production consumption, in collection, facilitation, and then pull factors. In this, I found it very difficult. When do we talk about environmental crime? When is it environmental harm occurring through legal trade? And when are there simply benefits in countries of destination? Might be in the illegal transports as well as in the legal transports. So intertwinement of legal, illegal, and informal. The main issue I want to address now is, does governance, does the control and prevention match this complexity? Of course, that's a yes and no question, but I'll go into more detail. I'll go over government agencies first, then corporations, and then civil society, and then their interaction. To my opinion, governments in Belgium and in Europe are together in the director's chair in dealing with this. Together, not always. They are not always cooperating. A range of administrations and governments are involved. Environmental administration is often informed by the EU level, important for policy, statistics, advice. They also exist on a Belgian level. And then you have the second level of environmental inspectorates. They are considered those with most expertise, are also responsible for follow-up of cases, are there for advice, but there's a bottleneck. The Port of Antwerp, the entire control system for all types of waste, it relies on 4 people. 4 individuals, not 4 full-time equivalents. If they're ill, they're not there. And that's a major bottleneck because if customs or police comes across something, they will ask those same people for advice or for follow-up of this case. So quite difficult for them to deal with all of that. In theory, customs of course has a lot of potential to deal with this, and they do look at e-waste and waste issues in general in their control system. Control system is system-based control. It's not possible to do transaction-based control given the scale that is going on. They do a risk analysis, and they use certain elements like where is it going, what's the value of a transport, or of course names of certain corporations or individuals they know have been involved in smuggling. However, they can only do that for the goods that are imported or exported out of Belgium. For transit, they actually rely on the countries where it comes from. They don't have the means to access the data to do the same risk analysis. But of course, they know that a lot of European countries don't actually do those controls, so that makes it very difficult. Customs also is generally considered to have a lack of expertise and training on these issues. often due to the fact that it's not considered a priority, as you might have had the time to read the quote by now. They're advised not to focus on non-fiscal matters too much. Then there's the Harbour's Master's Office. They're responsible for that flexible port policy in the sense that they're responsible for safety issues. E-waste is not always considered a safety issue. That might be different compared to other types of waste. I guess nuclear waste might be something else. But Harbour's Master's Office often has to unite that with economic elements. And this doesn't make it easy. One of the things that has been in place since 1st of January 2012, but actually has only gotten in actual practice in the last couple of months, is a police regulation regulating the shipment of second-hand vehicles. It was allowed to actually stuff that with whatever you want, and you don't have to provide a list with what is in there, compared to Rotterdam, for instance, where it's not allowed. So that was a major economic element in comparison. Anyway, they're acting upon this now. You actually have to provide a list with what is in there. And there are some people now walking the case and seeing whether something might not be right, and then they will not allow that vehicle on the port docks or to be shipped anyway. However, there's a problem even today because there are vehicles that are actually driven from Greece or Italy to be shipped in Antwerp. So that doesn't really make sense if you want to ship them to Africa. So there's a reason for this. And I have actually been called by the Antwerp Port Authority that they don't like me saying this, but if you get this this opinion from or this information from corporations as well as civil society actors like NGOs as well as administrations, I guess there might be some truth to it. The police also acts upon this, but not that much. Waste fraud is a priority, but it's met with limited staff. They often say it's very difficult for them to gather proof, to prosecute, similar to other environmental cases, of course. Hardly ever there have been successful cases in terms of e-waste, despite the fact that actually the judicial part of it is trying to act upon this. They have a waste fraud project where they want different actors to actually cooperate with each other, share data, but for now it still results in low fines and slow prosecution, although since I actually defended my PhD, it has been changing a bit. Also because there's a bit more attention for it now, actually spurred by initiatives by the recycling industry themselves, because they want to protect their urban mine. But now, what some of the smugglers I talked to actually said was the fines that are in place today, they make it part of their business plan. They can get maybe 20 to 30 containers to Ghana, maybe 1 or 2 they will have problems with, so they can just take that into account. We could think we'll rely on the Ghanaian authorities to do something, but there's no domestic legislation, like I said. It's of course no police or judicial priority. An environmental protection agency there, they will, given the limited staff, what they often will do is support them instead of criminalize them. What they meant by that is they want to address the environmental harm occurring instead of criminalizing them. They want to give them tools to avoid them from polluting the environment or harming themselves. In theory, of course, customs has a lot of potential since they empty every container or scan every container, but the awareness is not there. They have other concerns. And also, even if they would find something and consider it something that is not allowed into their country, it will still end up in the same dump site, because nobody will pay to ship it back to Europe. Sometimes they do, but hardly ever. Then we have corporations. Corporations, I consider them passive governance actors. Some are more active because they see an economic stake in this. Shipping agents, those that are responsible for booking the places on the ships, some of them actually do a good job in the sense of informing their clients, saying what is allowed, what is not, and then deciding whether they still want to work with them at a later time in case there has been trouble. Of course, you can understand those are the ones that actually can afford to do that. Some others just shift responsibility to the shipper and say, I don't know what's inside a container. Shipping lines are even further away from the shipper, so legally they are not responsible for it in terms of e-waste. They do, however, have commercial and ethical considerations because often it's their name that gets into the paper, not that of the shipper. So they're trying to look for solutions also in cooperation with governments, although it's been difficult. They're further in this in the UK because it's an island, whereas in Europe it's a lot more difficult, given that the continent has many more routes that can be followed to ship it, and that can also be altered to ship it. Role of producers and recyclers. Recyclers are worried about the raw materials inflow, or actually outflow, from Europe. So that's why they have a stake in this. They want to use the urban mine. They're concerned, however, for the absence of a level playing field today. European Union, some countries actually act upon this, some others don't. And this is causing shifts in the shipments. And for instance, companies often located in Belgium will complain that they are not treated the same way as someone in Germany or Italy or wherever. Producers are also responsible for take-back of their products, and they are actually doing this. For instance, in Ghana, they're working with communities there to actually take back equipment. Problem is that what they choose to take back is often the motherboards, which is valuable, but it's cherry picking. They won't take back some other less valuable and often more toxic components. Then we have civil society. I think they're still crucial today, but the support on this topic is waning. I should have mentioned the source. That right picture is not mine. The rest was. But one of the major campaigns, I guess you've all seen this picture before, it has raised awareness about this. And this actually has influenced flows towards Ghana. They can see this. When actors in the port of Rotterdam and Antwerp are acting upon e-waste or hazardous waste in general, they can see a fluctuation in what is flowing into their country. Important, however, is that they have influence on policy, but in this they haven't always been very practical. You might, for instance, advertise to avoid flows from occurring, so block everything, close all the gates in Europe, but you don't think about the consequences of this in Ghana or other countries. And that's why a lot of them have now been investing in capacity building projects. And this is one of those projects I actually attended and followed. Those guys you see there, well, some of them, are Agro-Bloshy boys. They work on the dump site, and they brought them to the office of an NGO and actually taught them how they could strip the plastic from a cable instead of burn it. So it was incredible to see that those guys really didn't know they could do this. They of course don't have the equipment for it, so that was a bit sad. In the end, they couldn't take the equipment home, which would have been good. But anyway, they're looking at ways to help them. Difficult thing there was that they of course wanted the copper. They wanted the copper to be able to sell it. So whereas the NGO needed that to be able to fund what they had just done that day. So there's some issues to work out. And then taking it all together, there are some other elements to take into account. Governments, as I said, they are cooperating. But those agencies might have similar intentions. Environmental issues are in there, but they're working with different realities. An inspectorate is often working based on trusting corporations, their own words, whereas police is often based on distrust, or legal systems often based on distrusting a case brought before them. So different work realities. Then there's a challenge of better information exchange between those agencies. Many of them say that information only flows in one direction. Customs will inform inspectorates who will make a case that will make it to the prosecutor, but they don't get information flowing back, so they don't know whether what they did is a good thing or not. So this will also not always motivate them to do it again. As I said, starting cooperation between shipping lines and governments. In general, many of the actors in governments, but also in corporations that are trying to deal with this, are exceptions to the rule. It's important to mention this because you have to imagine, like I said, 4 inspectorates working on this, maybe 2 police officers. If 2 of those don't get along, the network doesn't work, and unfortunately that has been the case. Then some advice I formulated towards the European Union is that their policy is very harmonized. The e-waste legislation and even the guidelines are quite clear, considerably clear. But implementation of that is not. Like I said, it's different depending on the country you're in. And of course, they're trying to set some standards, like you have to do so many inspections in each country, but that's touching a very sensitive issue of sovereignty, so I don't think they will be able to deal with that. Although the Belgian government has said they will propose it as an amendment, to some of the legislation. In conclusion, I already mentioned it, e-waste, used goods. It's often difficult to distinguish between those. Is it crime? Is it harm? Is it benefits? In any case, what I talk about, I want to make clear it's about beyond mere profit seeking. There's more involved in this. It's an intertwinement of criminal, illegal, informal, legal, and of course that is also associated with deeper rooted structural problems in production, treadmill of production, in social elements and political elements. The governance, the leading role is taken up by governments with limited resources, whereas I think a broader range of actors is relevant that might be able to address environmental harm better than those agencies merely dealing with environmental crime. In this, we'll have to take the supply chain into account, and it might be useful to involve some corporations in this. Then, in general, I guess you can see there's a very low risk of a penalty, and going back to the model I used, are we really speaking softly and carrying a big stick? Is there a pyramid when there's nothing at the top, or hardly anything at the top? And in a lot of this, it's a transnational case, but a lot of the implementation remains local and fragmented. Of course, that's an issue that's general for environmental crime or transnational crime. But I hope this can develop. And that was my story. So I hope you have some more questions. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. We'll have our two speakers. I don't know, you can sit on this table or go to the front. I don't think it matters too much. But questions from the floor would be welcome. Especially as I haven't thought of any questions yet. So please, questions from the floor. If necessary, I do have some. Any takers? Thank you.
Question for Lieselot. Have your findings had any traction with the Belgian government?
I had to present my findings in Flemish Parliament, so they're dealing with that. Because it's Belgium, so there's a new legislation that makes the regional governments responsible for the transit issues. So they have asked me to provide some advice, although it's very difficult because, as it is the case right now, the inspectors that are working with it, the transit cases are on a federal level, whereas import and export are on a regional level. Those same persons will probably not be transferred to the other organizations. So a lot of the knowledge and expertise will go to waste. And they've asked me to, provide some advice towards the European Union level. I don't know whether they will deal with that or not.
I have a question to Paul, because I was wondering why you used the phrase criminalization. Does it have to be criminal law, or could also regulatory or administrative law, administrative law be employed? So what does the...
Oh, with our definition?
Yeah.
Well, because we're kind of thinking about redefining the whole thing. It could be, there could be various forms of criminalization, I suppose. But I use that. And I guess the devils are in the detail in some sense, right? Because you could say, well, there may be different types. But the kind of thing we were thinking is that, if you threaten to disrupt capitalist production, and to kind of be a little more blunt, that would be criminalized almost always. And so here's the same situation, but now we're threatening natural production, which threatens our very existence, and we're not willing to criminalize those things. So that's kind of how we were thinking about the distinction. Could it be a different type of? Criminalization could mean a number of things, I suppose.
That's what I was thinking. Would it be a broader social movement against that behavior, or what do you mean?
Yeah, it could include a number of different kinds of punishments, for example, right? That doesn't, because if we're reconceptualizing the whole thing, it doesn't have to be the way that we think of it, punishment now, I suppose, if that helps. Yeah.
I wondered if you had any evidence as yet about the second proposition where you talked about pitting workers against the environment
Yeah.
for example, losing their jobs. I wondered if there was any gathered evidence in support of that yet?
Yeah.
Say something about that.
Yeah. The question is there evidence that workers are pitted against the environment? And I think if you talk to people who kind of study the kind of, even in the environmental justice social movements, a lot of times they'll try to set some of those contradictions up. And sometimes indeed they do. And I kind of gave the example of coal country in the US, kind of that's exactly what happens. In fact, coal workers see their jobs completely threatened by, and you guys can attest to it, or you can attest to this, because
there's not only that economic attachment, but also in the case of coal, a real strong cultural attachment.
Yeah, a cultural attachment
it's
to.
Seen as a traditional cultural practice.
Right. So a lot of times, I mean, just simply saying we're going to regulate coal more, you're threatening those jobs, threatening culture. Same thing in the timber industry. I think you could make some of those arguments where, we know we have some destructive practices, and you see the workers in that industry really not like the environmentalists and say some really nasty things about them because they see them as trying to cut back on production, and so that threatens their jobs. So I think in certain industries you see it more than others, but I think that there's evidence, at least. I haven't tested it empirically, and I'm sure there's somebody out there that has in another discipline. I haven't read their stuff yet, but we're kind of looking for those examples and looking to see how we can test this.
Maybe when I say something about what you're saying a little bit. No, I was interested in the closure of a local aluminium smelting factory in Ashington, which closed in March, this year. To a large extent due to carbon emissions and the reliance on coal from the as the producer of the main energy. And actually I was very surprised when I sort of able to test it out as to the absolute lack of union kind of activity against the closure for any kind of closure. Sort of already since there lots of the previous mining industry that used to be there, and now lots of this set of jobs. And there was absolutely no kind of union activity and no particular uproar against the closure which was in part at least due to the sort of emissions technology development of Europe and our government in particular being very keen to be seen as super green.
Right.
So, there's almost a worrying lack of any kind of activism of any kind against anything.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, and that's really interesting too, because I think in terms of workers, I think a lot of times, in unions even, they've been sold that, hey, if you want to keep jobs, you have to make concessions that incorporate technology and more production. And I think in some sense, at least in the US, it's kind of like, oh yeah, well of course, we're going to have to make these concessions. I mean, they're practically gone in some sense, unions. And kind of accepted the kind of fate of produce more with, the help of technology, and we'll just give up on the fight, in some ways, to protect, jobs and so forth.
I was going to comment on that quickly. There was an example in Peru that's kind of related, although not quite as formal. A couple of years back, the government did try and crack down on illegal gold mining, where the mercury gets into the water. That's the environmental harm there. And the the illegal miners rioted. That was their economic source of income. So enforcing the environmental regulation led to quite coordinated and organised mass riots. So there was reaction there. So yeah, the workers' vested interest is in environmental harm, and that is. Anyway, question?
A related issue that Paul and I have been trying to
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what we're thinking, you know, you come into an area and you totally disrupt that area. It's the problem of too many resources. Sometimes you see it described in the literature of what do they call it? Sent you that kind of phrasing. Natural resource curse, where we have and then somebody comes in and takes all of those resources and then leaves, and then because they've reorganized the whole area, now you've got tremendous amounts of social, you know, at least reported social problems and other things.
I just wanted to pick up on some of the other issues that you've just been talking about, and make it back to something I think that Nigel was talking about a bit earlier. When it comes to these kinds of calculations, it's also about how these problems are framed. And so, you know, in a way, for other sorts of occupational health and safety issues, certainly in Australia, for example, if there's asbestos down in a factory site or other sorts of things, then the unions are actually going to be very, very strong on that. But because they see kind of the environmental health consequences, it's not framed in that way.
Right.
They're considered to be sort of externalities. And even in the sort of recycling industry, things are framed in different kinds of ways, and it's put forward as an economics versus health kind of calculus, when in fact it's not at all. These things are not actually distinct, but you know, the whole framing of it makes it look as if you know it's an either or situation when you sort of kind of see, I guess this comes through that sort of neoliberal rationality lens. Now it also might go back to some things that other people were talking about how do you change the normative framework? How do you actually make that now be framed? It's what I call in the Australian context it's the Treadmill kind of approach, which is basically, it's fundamentally about jobs, and all those other sorts of things come second.
Any more questions? Last chance. Tanya, shall I hand back to you for closing comments? We're a little bit ahead of time, so if anyone comes up with more questions, just interrupt Tanya if you want to talk.
No. But thank you for